nations not ship sporting arms, any kind of arms, to a country that's a human rights abuser. The UN Human Rights Council, at the behest of China, is taking the position that a country which allows the private ownership of firearms is definitionally a human rights abuser. So there are all kinds of things that can happen as a result of that. They could, it's unlikely in the short term, but they could say to countries that produce a lot of our sporting arms, Turkey produces arms for Benelli and for Beretta, Italy, of course, produces arms, Japan and the others, all are signatories to the treaty, and they could say, you cannot, under this treaty, ship any arms to the United States for use in that country. And these are the kinds of things that I don't think the American people are very familiar with, because this treaty sort of went under the radar in the sense that the public and the press doesn't pay a heck of a lot of attention to what goes on at the UN, sometimes for good reason.
Right. Now, the first thing that entered into my mind as we started talking about this is, how is this not a violation of an oath of office to support and defend the Constitution? How is agreeing to this not a violation?
I would argue that it is, but so are a lot of the other things that the last president did.
Very true. It seems like words don't have meaning anymore.
The real question is, what do you do about it? And so there are some things that can be done and some things that can't be done. The new president has, and the Congress have, two choices. Once a treaty is sent up to the Senate, it has essentially perpetual life. The sort of poster child for that, if you recall what they call the law of the Sea Treaty, which was negotiated in the 1960s by Elliot Richardson, is still up there, and every once in a while they keep trying to bring it up for a vote. So if you've got a treaty that's been sent to the Senate, and all of a sudden you get a Senate that's friendly to the goals of the treaty, it can be brought up and ratified. What the Senate could do, and it now has two choices, and they're not going to vote on it anytime soon. They could, with a solid majority, bring it up and put a spear in its heart. That would kill it. The other thing that could happen is that the President of the United States can withdraw the nation's signature from the treaty. Remember, we did that on the ABM treaty some years ago. So that's another option that we have. But even without that, even without us being a part of it, the treaty can affect the way other nations view and deal with the United States in terms of shipping and sale and use of sporting arms.
Now, David, this is one example. Your book's almost prophetic in this sense, because in your book, Shall Not Be Infringed, the New Threats to Your Second Amendment, you discuss how gun control advocates would be using the international community to create this end round of constitutional rights. Is this a tactic that we will be seeing more of in the future?
Yeah, one of the things that has to happen, and this goes to the treaty and it goes to all else that's being done, is that the Supreme Court there have to be two appointments to the Supreme Court. We have the Scalia vacancy, as you know, and President Trump has promised that he will nominate a good judge in the mold of Edmund Scalia to that seat. That puts us where we were when Scalia was on the court, or a little behind that, because good as the next justice might be, he's not going to be Edmund Scalia, who was was one of the giants of Supreme Court jurisprudence of the last century. But it does prevent backsliding on decisions that have already been made. The problem involves decisions that haven't been made, because under the Second Amendment or under any of the amendments guaranteeing fundamental rights, the courts can, in fact, legitimize what they call reasonable restrictions on those rights. The sort of poster child example is the First Amendment, where they say you can't yell fire in a crowded theater. Well, there are hundreds of different restrictions that are deemed reasonable that have been imposed on First Amendment rights through 100 cases that have gone to the Supreme Court. In the case of the Second Amendment, we haven't had those cases. So the influence of international law, the influence of progressive judicial thinking on the court has an impact on what kinds of decisions come out. Let me give you an example. One of the decisions that the court's going to have to deal with relatively soon is that there's a conflict in the jurisdictions, in the circuits, over whether or not it is reasonable under the Second Amendment to ban the AR-15, the so-called assault weapon. One of the circuits has said that is unreasonable, it's unconstitutional. The right to own and use an AR-15 is guaranteed by the Constitution as interpreted by the Heller decision. Another court has said, well, not really. We find it reasonable to ban that weapon. The same kind of discussion is going on in different courts at lower levels about concealed carry laws. Ultimately, dozens of cases will be pushed upward, and some of them will have to be accepted by the Supreme Court. And dozens of decisions will, over the course of the next few years, define what government can and cannot do in terms of infringing on the right to self-defense and the right to keep and bear arms. So the court needs to be made secure because it's not one decision, it's not one judge. And remember, the Heller decision, which guaranteed or interpreted the Second Amendment as the founders wanted it, was a 5-4 decision. So even with the replacement of one justice, it's still 5-4 on that court, and it's not going to be safe until it's 6-3.
Sounds like a volatile couple of years to come in the battle for so-called gun control. David, how do you see the lay of the land in the next couple of years? Do you see it depending upon the president?
Yeah, I can say two things. One, the lay of the land is a heck of a lot better than it looked like it might be this summer. Because gun owners, believers in the Second Amendment, believers in a lot of our traditional freedom, dodged a real bullet in November. If Mrs. Clinton had been elected, the Supreme Court would in essence have been gone. The Bill of Rights would have been rewritten in essence by the Supreme Court, and we'd lose a lot of the traditional freedoms that motivated voters to go out and make sure she wasn't elected. So we dodged a bullet. But the opposition, as you know, in confronting these issues, the opposition to firearms ownership, the opposition to the Second Amendment, is almost driven by a religious fervor, by people who actually believe that if they could snap their fingers and abolish firearms, that we would live in a peaceful utopia. There'd no longer be robberies, there'd no longer be muggings, everybody would get along with everybody. John Bolton, in the foreword to our book, said that it reminded him of the 60s and 70s with the unilateral disarmament crowd that believed that if we just gave up all of our weapons, the world would be peaceful. Well, it isn't. And neither is the country, because there are bad people, and there are oftentimes a need to defend oneself. And in addition to that, in this country, we have a tradition of being able to use firearms for any legal purpose, including hunting and the like. But it's self-defense, the right to protect one's liberty and one's safety and one's family and community that lie at the base of the Second Amendment of the Constitution.
And I think at this moment it's probably best for me to not add anything, because I couldn't say any better than David Keene, the opinion editor of the Washington Times and author of Shall Not Be Infringed, The New Threats to Your Second Amendment. Pick it up where finer books are sold. David, thank you so much for coming on the show, and look forward to talking to you after the inauguration and further in 2017.
My pleasure. I'm always happy to come on.
The show will be right back. But first, a word from Al Sharpton.
Good evening, Rev. Thanks
Good evening,
to
Rev.
you, Ed. Is this Groundhog Day 2? We are watching that was Attorney General Eric Holder, ABDs, about some Republicans at home are already beating the drums of war. Today, the Pentagon refuted that claim. And he said the American people do not want him to, quote, dwindling, they do not want him dwindling his thumbs. You can get a gig as a contortionist. Intravenous fluids and pills coated with gelatin. We don't leave our women or men in uniform behind. It's a monument to the hubris of Dick Cheney, Representative Raul Labrador. Years of abuse. I personally apologize to Mr. Peebles. Just ask to soon-to-be former Congressman. Democrats are outright jitty. CIA's counterterrorism Counterterrorism Center. Veteran Affairs Secretary Shinseki. Why do I always mess up his name? Shinseki. I love my critics. I have fun with that.
Politics Nation with the Reverend Al Sharpton starts right now. Good evening, Rev.
Good evening, Dr. Dyson.
But wait, there's more.
And we will much about that be committed. So there's no real conflict. Michael Druniak, including Lincoln himself, Daniel Day-Lewis. Behind Monica Lewinsky, the one and only Trey Songz is here. But Allison Lundergan Grimes, Gina De Jesus, when Gina De Jesus, Tea Party challenger Matt Bivens. People don't want to have their Social Security overall. The Republican savior, Mark Rubio's big night in evolution and Galileo. I mean, this whole thing of Galileo. America's changed. Unless IT and Skillets, President Putin doing something similar back in, it won't change this fundamental fact about the GOP. Just how absurd these attacks is. Nearly 6 months after the dangerous traffic jam, the Thai military says, my friend for many years, Ilyana Van Zandt. There's nothing there.
And they gave this guy a TV show? Let's get back to our show.
Hey, thanks for listening to Behind Enemy Lines Radio. I'm Gene. Russ Gallo, my partner in crime and co-host, couldn't make it this week, but we both want to thank you for listening to our show. Check us out at www.behindenemylinesradio.us. Check us out on the Facebooks and the Twitters at BEL_radio. And if you missed any part of the show that we usually do live 10 p.m. Eastern Time on Spreaker, you can catch us at any one of our rebroadcast outlets, including WNJC 107.5 FM in beautiful Jasper, Florida, WDDQ 92.1 FM in Adel, Georgia, and our newest outlet on the airwaves, WLBB 1330 AM in Carrollton, Georgia, all part of the Red Nation Rising Radio Network. You can also check us out at KLRN Radio, High Plains Talk Radio, and Sackheads Media, ICRN, the Internet's Conservative Radio Network, which powers Red Nation Rising, and Lanterns Radio. Go check them out at lanterns.buzz. But even if you missed those rebroadcasts, which, by the way, are listed on our website, www.behindenemylinesradio.us, you can check us out on demand on iTunes, Spreaker, TuneIn, Stitcher, Podbay, Player FM. You can discover us on Google Play Music. You can find us on SoundCloud. And, of course, you can always listen to us on the mighty iHeartRadio. As we round out another great show, I want to thank David Keene for coming on the show. As always, check out the Washington Times and all the great news and opinions you can find in that great publication. I want to go back to something we talked about earlier in the show, this idea of the illegitimacy of the Trump presidency, which in part is based upon the idea that the Russians, those dirty Russians, they hacked the election, they influenced the outcome. They did these dirty things and got into Democratic dirty secrets and exposed them. Their dirty deed exposed our dirty deed, and it's all dirty. And it's all based on this idea, propagated by the Obama administration and supposedly backed up by evidence that they found, saying that the Russians hacked the DNC. That they also probably attempted to attack and hack the RNC. And that's the basis for this new mandate. We really won. It wasn't the fact that our candidate stunk. It wasn't the fact that she ran a poor election. It's the Russians. It's always somebody else's fault. And I mentioned during that portion of the show where we discussed this whole conspiracy that a cybersecurity legend disagreed. Now, I did a little digging. I did a lot of digging, and I found, Lord help me, Ed Schultz, and an interview he did on RT. Granted, consider the source is possibly an illegitimate source covering an illegitimate operation.